Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be doing another video based on a question that I was asked on Ask Historians, the subreddit where I frequently get content from. Reddit user Cricket Chemical 42 asks, did the USSR use outdated armored vehicles against the Japanese forces during World War II? Did the Soviets take their outdated equipment like the BT series to face the Japanese in the eastern borders? So that's quite an interesting question. As you probably know, there were a number of armed conflicts between the Soviet Union and Japan coming up to World War II, most notably, of course, the Lake Hassan and Khalkhin Gol battles. Now, in both of these battles, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, won quite handily, and Japan was forced to relinquish their claims on Soviet and the Mongolian territory. Even though you kind of had these armed conflicts, the Soviet leadership felt that the Japanese were not going to try anything anytime soon. And of course, the most dangerous threat was coming up from the West. Even though there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression pact between USSR and Germany, there weren't really any illusions about how long that pact was going to hold. So new tanks like the T-34 and the KV-1 were prioritized for Western military districts. Now, during the war, of course, especially in the early days, already trained and established units with old tanks like the BT and the T-26 were pulled from eastern regions and sent to the west. But there was still quite a large amount of tank forces left in the Far East and the Transbaikal military districts. So these tankers, as you can imagine, didn't really have high priority when it came to new equipment. So all they had were old, BT series T-26 tanks. They actually had quite a large quantity of T-38s, T-37s, T-27s even. These are the little tankettes. So not exactly a powerful force. There's nothing you can do with them in Europe, but against a potential Japanese invasion, that's good enough. And so the tank units, they didn't really languish, with what they were given. There's actually quite a bit of initiative. So BT-7 tanks were upgraded with extra armor. This armor was taken either from T-26 or other BT tanks that were scrapped, or it was taken from captured German tanks. So this was extra between 13 and 15 millimeters of armor. Quite an interesting modification to these Far Eastern tanks. Now, what they did to the T-38, T-37 was a bit more interesting. They would actually, these tanks were armed only with machine guns. So they would take out the machine gun mount and put in a 20 millimeter autocannon, the same Schwach autocannon that was used on T-60 tanks. There was also an option to put in extra armor, same treatment as the BT tanks got, but then the tank would become too heavy and would not be able to swim anymore. I'm not going to focus on these tanks too much. There'll be some links down below. You can read about them on my blog about the trials and everything like that. But so back to the T-26 tanks and BT-7s. So in February of 1945, you had the Yalta Conference where Stalin had promised to begin preparations with the war against Japan and attack no later than 3 months after victory over Germany. And true to his word, in the spring, in March rather, of 1945, there were orders given to start rearming Far Eastern tank brigades with new tanks, so T-30-45 tanks. Interestingly enough, the order was given to rearm only the 1st Battalion of each brigade, which makes sense. You kind of want to spread out the new tanks that are coming in and let every unit get accustomed to them. But the old tanks that were being written off as a result of this upgrade, they weren't scrapped. They were kept in the unit's reserve. And it was another interesting note that suggests that these tanks were still considered very much combat capable Back in 1941, there was an order passed that only officers could be commanders of tanks in the Red Army. And that was true for the majority of the war until in 1945, in early 1945, there was a suggestion that, we have enlisted men, senior NCOs who are very familiar with BT-7 tanks, T-26 tanks. We can free up officers and allow these enlisted men to be tank commanders. Now, I'm not entirely certain whether the suggestion was actually taken and if these senior NCOs were ever actually tank commanders before the war ended, but this is sort of another indication that the USSR, the Red Army, was fully willing to commit these tanks to the battle against Japan. So by August 5th, 1945, there were 6,234 tanks of all types in the Far Eastern Theater. Of those 6,234, 1,272 were T-26s, 797 were BT-7s, 101 BT-5s, and 304 T-38s, about 120 of which had the modifications I described earlier. So in total, there were 2,787 obsolete tanks in action in the Far East. So 44% of the total number. It's not nothing, definitely, but it's, not a majority, as the shipment of modern vehicles had taken its toll. The situation did actually change when the Red Army was prepared to invade Manchuria and engage Japanese forces. The proportion of vehicles committed to the battle changed drastically. So I have numbers here from the 6th Guards Tank Army, where they had taken with them 85 M4A2 76W tanks. So that includes both the VVSS and HVSS versions that had just arrived in the summer of 1945. They had 416 T-3485s, 193 Su-100s, 26 Su-76s, 177 BT, so BT-7 and BT-5 tanks, and 22 T-26 tanks. So this was 199 out of 119 tanks, or 22%. So you can see the proportion of these obsolete tanks was slashed in half. Now, not all of these tanks actually set out. Only 11 of these T-26 tanks actually drove into Manchuria when war was declared. Unfortunately, these T-26 tanks were not very worn out by that point, and all of them broke in the first few days of March. The driving was through very difficult conditions. It was very hot. They had to keep up, since the whole operation was based on surprise. You had to keep to very, very strict marching speeds in order to actually make that scheduled crossing of the Greater Hingan mountain range. So the T-26s couldn't take it. They fell out of action in the first couple of days. They all had to be evacuated. Again, not just abandoned, but evacuated. And the repair units actually complained that all of these old tanks have used up all of our tractors. They're being used to pull all these crappy old tanks that have broken down, rather than pulling more modern tanks out of mud and kind of keeping them going. Now, the BT-7s and BT-5s, they fared a little bit better, so they could actually get to the destination. 57 of them arrived where they were going. So, not exactly a great performance, considering that these tanks never actually saw battle with any Japanese tanks. So as you can see, even though newer models of tanks were available, the Red Army was prepared for the worst. If the Japanese had put up a more effective resistance than they actually did, there was a large stock of T-26 and BT tanks to commit to the fighting, and a large amount of trained crews that would be using them.